Okay, Mukhanim? Okay. I don't remember exactly what the title of the shir was. I wanted to talk about freeing hostages, hostage negotiations. That's wrong, but it's really a multi-pronged shaila, because there's freeing hostages by route of money, there's freeing hostages by route of a trade, there's freeing hostages by route of an army raid, and each one of them has its own shaila set. I don't know how many of them I'll get to now. We'll try to start and we'll see where we go. So now I just want to be makdim. Of course, it goes without saying that Pidyon Shvuyin is a tremendous inyan, a tremendous mitzvah, right? The Gemara Bava Basra, I think the Daf Yomi either just learned it or is about to learn it. The Gemara Bava Basra says Pidyon Shvuyin is a mitzvah rabbah, and the Gemara is masber because there's three components of destituteness that a person could endure. It could be financial, it could be meaning food, clothing, and danger. And shevi is ispukulu. Someone who's in captivity is on shaky ground in regards to his food, in regards to his being clothed, and in regards to his actual life. So being paid to someone from a matzav of shevi is the highest level. In Hilchos Tzedakah, I'm sure aware, in Simon Zayin, the Shulchan Aruch says that Pidyon Shvuyin precedes and supersedes any other form of tzedakah. The Rambam paskins like this as well. So it goes without saying that Pidyon Shvuyin is a very, very chashuv part of how public funds are supposed to be spent in Judaism. Now, more so than that even, is that I've mentioned this in the past, but I'll mention it again quickly. Pidyon Shvuyin has led to some great, great outcomes. Meaning famously the Ravid Harishain, right? Everybody knows there was three Ravids. There was the Ravid Harishain, is Rav Avram ibn Dawud. He was a Spanish Talmud Chacham, a historian and a Talmud Chacham. Then there's Rav Avram Av Bezdin, that's the Sefer Eshkol, that's the second Ravid. And then the third Ravid is the famous Ravid, the Ravid al Rambam, that's Rav Avram ben David. He's the third and most famous Ravid. He's actually a son-in-law of the second Ravid. And this is the Ravids. Now the first Ravid, Rav Avram ibn Dawud, in his Sefer HaKabbalah it's called, it has nothing to do with Kabbalah, it has to do with Kabbalah Satira. He writes a story of the four captives. Now the Olam is familiar with the story of the four captives. There was Rabbeinu Chushiel, Rabbeinu Elchanan, Rabbeinu Shmaryo, and the fourth one I believe we don't know his name. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Rabbeinu Moshe. There was four captives who were on a ship. They were leaving a rabbinical conference in Bari. Now Bari is in Italy. Rabbeinu Tam famously writes, Kimi Bari Teitzei Torah. Bari at that time in the early 1000s, maybe even earlier, maybe this is the 900s still, was a center of Torah. It seems there had been a Yarchikal over there, maybe a holiday share, and they were, all these four Rabbanim together were on a ship leaving Bari, and they were attacked by pirates, and the pirates took them, and the rest of the story is famous. They were ransomed at 4 different North African ports, meaning not African, but 4 different Mediterranean ports. One of them ended up in Kairouan in Africa, one of them ended up in Egypt, 2 of them ended up in Spain, and from there Torah got diffused. This wellspring of Torah got diffused. There's a famous humorous story that's brought down in different places, that when one of them reached the shores, I think this was in Spain, he came and he walked into a shul, and the Chacham Haderish, the Rav of the shul, was a person by the name of Reb Nassan, and Reb Nassan, the Chacham Haderish, was getting up and asking a real bomb kasha. He says, the Mishnah in Yuma says that the Kohen Gadol would go to the mikveh 5 times on Yom Kippur in the Seder Avodah. But Lamaisa, the Mishnah in Yuma also says, Al kol hazav hazat tzricha tefillah. Every spritching that was done on the Mizbeach needs a tefillah as well. Now, if you count up the spritchings that were done on the Mizbeach, it's much more than 5. So he said it's a big stira. The Mishnah seems to say 5. The Mishnah also says it's much more tefillahs than 5. And he couldn't give Zachanetz, he couldn't give a teretz. And this, I think this was Rabbeinu Moshe, who was there, raises his hand and says, Ulai Yacholiot, he says, that the tefillah that's being musker in the Mishnah with Al Kol Hazav Hazat Tzricha Tefillah means dipping the Agudas Ezev back into the dam. You need to be toivel the Agudas Ezev into the dam to spritz with. And there's taka many of those, but tefillah of the Kohen Gadol in the mikveh, there's only 5 of that. And to his credit, this Chacham Haderish of Nassan was so impressed by the clear wisdom and Talmud Chacham Shaf of this newly released captive who had found himself in his community, and he said, from now on, you're the Rav over here. And there's all these type of stories. So Pidyon Shvuyin played a pivotal role in the Hafatza of Torah, and the Seder Hafatza of Torah throughout Klal Yisrael. So Pidyon Shvuyin is very central. there's dozens of stories of Rebbes, Greaser Rebbes, who were either involved in Pidyon Shvuyin or were captured themselves. Sadly, many of the Greaser Rebbes spent some time in prison. The Rizhner, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Alter Rebbe, the Chiddushei Rim, and many others. It's an endless amount of Alter Rebbes who spent the time in prison. So Pidyon Shvuyin became a very pivotal, the Sasaver, I think, it could be the Shpal Yezeda. Like, it became a very pivotal part of Hasidic lore, Hasidic history. The Gaon was in jail for a certain point. It became a very pivotal part of lore and Hasidic history. So Pidyon Shvuyin, suffice to say, is almost without equal in regards to chashivos and chavivos and the chaymer that it has in Klal Yisrael's seder of things. Now, Lemaisa, there's a big caveat to Pidyon Shvuyin. There's a big limitation to Pidyon Shvuyin. That's the Sugya in Gittin. Now, the Sugya in Gittin, it's a Mishnah. I'll read the Mishnah and then I'll go back to stories for a minute. I apologize, too many stories. But the Mishnah in Gittin says as follows. The Mishnah in Gittin is on Daf Mem Hey, Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says as follows. It's a Mishnah. We have to see what the reasons is, what the halacha is, what the limitations are. Let me just read the Mishnah first to set the table. The Mishnah says as follows. Ein paidinas ashvuyin, yeser achdei demeim. You're not allowed to be paida a shavoi, a captive, for more than his value. B'fnei tikkun ha'olam. Because of tikkun ha'olam, which means the world has to run smoothly. And now what exactly the rationale for that is, well, again, something will be discussed further in the Gemara and in the Paiskim. And then the Mishnah says another din. Ein mavrichanas ashvuyin. You're not allowed to encourage shvuyim to escape, which is, again, something that could be very relevant to our discussion. You're not allowed to encourage shvuyim to escape b'pnei tikkun ha'olam, because again, that could mess with the proper seder advarim of the world. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, b'pnei takanas hashvuyim, no, it's for the benefit of the shvuyim themselves. Because if you're going to encourage shvuyim to escape, then the guards are going to take it a lot more seriously, and the conditions that these shvuyim are going to find themselves in are going to tighten substantially. So ultimately, in the long run, you're harming the shvuyim themselves by encouraging them to escape. Now, this is a Mishnah that seems to place severe limitations on this overarching value of Pidyon Shvuyin. I mean, the Gemara Baba Basra and Gepaskin and Shulchan Aruch says Pidyon Shvuyin is of utmost importance, of the highest value. The Gemara in Gittin, the Mishnah in Gittin, is placing limitations on this inyan of Pidyon Shvuyin. Now, how does this halach l'maisa? What are the actual ramifications of this din? So I want to read you a piece from the Yamsha Shleima, and then we'll talk about the story a little bit more in depth. The Yamsha Shleima in Gittin, Afanart, says as follows. It's a few lines. Let me read you the Yamsha Shleima because he's a primary source on the story and on this inyan, and then we'll go to the story. The Yamsha Shleima says as follows. Shamati al Marami Rotenberg. He says, I heard about the Marami Rotenberg. Marami Rotenberg is from the Gedolei Hadar, famous from the Gedolei Hadar in the Rhine. He was probably the Gadol Hadar. There's even a nusach that says that he was the first chief rabbi of Germany. Chief rabbis was not a popular thing back in the day. He was the first chief rabbi of Germany, possibly. It says, Shamati al Marami Rotenberg, Zechrein Levracha, Shayatafas b'Migdal Eisenheim. He was imprisoned in the Tower of Eisenheim, which is a German prison. Kama shanim, for several years. V'hasar tava min ha'kehila sach gadol. The king, who we know from other sources was King Rudolf IX, I believe, a German ruler, Rudolf IX, was teveya from the kehila sach gadol, which we know from other sources was 20,000 Reichstaler, which was an exorbitant amount of money. I don't know exactly what a Reichstaler is worth, but from the way the Poskim were discussing it in the time, it was an exorbitant amount of money. The Kehila very badly wanted to be paid their Gadol Hadar, their Rebbe from prison. The Maram himself, the Gadol Hadar, did not allow it. He says it's a Mishnah, it's a straight Mishnah in Gittin, you're not allowed to be paid a Shava Yosim Mechdei Demeim. V'tamani, says the Yamsha Shleima. Talmud Chacham Muflig. The Marami Rotenberg was a Talmud Chacham Muflig. There was no one, there was no replacement for the Marami Rotenberg in Torah v'Chasidus. It's permitted al pi halacha to be paid him for all money in the world. If because of his great humility, maybe the Marami Rotenberg didn't want to be machzik himself as a Talmud Chacham Muflig. It's nice to be an anav, but you should have been chayshish for the bittul Torah of yourself, of Gans Klal Yisrael. You're the Gadol Hadar. Kasher kasa ba'atzmei, shehu yoshev b'chayshich v'tzamavis b'li Torah v'ayra. Like the Marami Rotenberg wrote about himself, that he's sitting there in the dark without Torah v'ayra. The Marami Rotenberg, and this is a tshuva in the Hagais Maminam, and I'll share some of these sources, wrote about himself, Chzitzta, Ankin Svarim, in the dark, Migdal Eisenheim, I can't learn, I don't know anything. So he should have been chayshish that he had to get out. This is the Yamsha Shleima who has a penchant for harsh writing, is writing about the Marami Rotenberg, a Gadol Hadar from 300 years before him, saying, I don't understand how he could have subjected himself to this. I don't understand how he could have paskin like this. It's unacceptable. He should have allowed them to be paid himself. That's fine. He spirals out. It's going to spiral out of control. They're going to do this to other famous Rabbanim and Chachamim. They're going to arrest them. It says, Kigam shamati I heard about Rudolph. I heard about King Rudolph that it was in his plan. Litvais gam harash talmidei. He also wanted to be paid to the Talmud of the Talmud of the Ram Rotenberg, the Rosh. The Rosh became aware of this plan. Ubarach Toledo. He ran to Toledo in Spain. Now this is already where it gets a little bit murky, exactly the timeline and the storyline. But this is the story that the Yam Shlomo writes. Ba'ifin halachi mamish. Yam Shlomo is writing this in a halacha piece on the Mishnah and Gittin, where he's strongly questioning the Merami Rotenberg's halachic rationale to allow himself to remain imprisoned in Eisenheim. So now let's just back it up. Let's talk about the story, the Tkufa, and we'll see what the clock lets us get to in regards to the Psak. So as follows: the Merami Rotenberg lived in Germany in the Rhine, which is the Rhine River Valley in Germany in the 1200s. The Merami Rotenberg, I'm going to guess, was born probably Pachas at 1225. Let's say he dies in 1293. I'm going to assume that's more or less his years. I could be off by a little. Don't hold me to it. Now, 7 years before his death, in 1280. 84, maybe 85, 1285, let's say, the Merami Rotenberg, because the persecution was intensifying, because it was inhospitable to live in the Rhine anymore, and Jews had started making migrations and escaping Germany, the Merami Rotenberg decides to escape with his entire family and move probably to Spain, would have been his intention to move. Now, the Merami Rotenberg was an older person, a known person, a Reish Mishpacha. He gathered his family together and he said, let's go, we're going to go to Spain. And he makes the trek in the dark of night and he escapes Germany and he arrives in Lombardy, Italy, is where he arrives to. He makes it out of Germany. He arrives to Lombardy, Italy. And in Lombardy, because he was traveling in small groups, meaning so as not to attract attention, his daughters were in one wagon, his sons were here, his son-in-law was, meaning it was just to diffuse the attention. And Merami Rotenberg, his family, and probably his Talmidim were traveling in various different pocket groups. And they had made up that when they reached Lombardy, which was, out of the danger zone, they will regroup, and from there they'll travel caravan style to Italy, to their final destination. The Merami Rotenberg successfully escapes Germany and makes it to Lombardy, Italy. Once he's there, he's waiting for his family to regroup and to join him. And sadly, a Meiser, a Jewish apostate, a Meshumid, who lived in Lombardy, recognized the Merami Rotenberg, who must have been disguised to some level. He must have been dressed up to some level. This Meshumid recognized the Merami Rotenberg and turned him in to the local magistrate in Lombardy, who had some sort of primitive expatriation, extradition treaty with Rudolf IX of Germany, and the Merami Rotenberg is extradited back to Germany to the auspices of Rudolf, and he's imprisoned in Germany. That's why you'll find in some of the different chuvas, and the reason why I say this is because the Meram was the God Ladar, literally the God Ladar. His Talmidim are the Rosh, the Agayis Maimoni, the Sefer Trumis, the Tashbitz, many famous Gedolei Ashkenaz are his Talmidim, and from them, Talmid of the Meram is the God Ladar. And in a lot of these different chuvas, Lamashal, the Sefer Tashbitz, or the Sefer Parnis, or the Hagayis Maimoni, or even the Merami Rotenberg's own Pirush on Aulis, the Merami Rotenberg has a Pirush on Tyrus that he wrote. A lot of it was comprised while he was in prison. You'll see that he was imprisoned in many different locations and under many different terms. Meaning it seems that originally when he was arrested in Lombardy, was very harsh. He was a felon running from the law, he was in prison. Rudolf sent an edict that we have, I think still today, that says that since he was trying to escape with state property, i.e. anything that belongs to him belongs to the king, he was trying to escape with state property, everything of his should be confiscated and he has to be returned back to Germany. So that was extreme, harsh conditions. Later on, they negotiated some sort of better conditions that might have even been something like a house arrest, like in prison, but he had the ability to interact with the Talmidim. There's some nuschayos that say he was even able to write a Sefer Torah. So the conditions of his imprisonment vary over the 7 years, and he was imprisoned in Mannheim and Eisenheim and different prisons, towers. He was imprisoned for 7 years until his death. Now, the Merami Rotenberg, it's a plea to see this, meaning there's a tremendous amount of evidence of his imprisonment. The Hagayis Maimoni, in several places in the Sefer, says that I went to visit Sha'alti SP Meiri Maram, B'migdal, X, Y, and Z, in such and such a prison, and he told me as follows. There's a tshuva l'mashal in the end of Ishus in Hagayis Maimoni. There's something called the Chuvas Maimoni, which is Chuvas, at the end of it that the Hagayis Maimoni puts in. In the Hagayis Maimoni, in the end of Nashim, puts in Chuvas and Zishus, and in there he has a Chuva from the Rami Rotenberg about Shaila that's Negeya, and the Rami Rotenberg writes that nearly the psak should be like this, but I'm telling you now, I'm sitting here in prison, I don't have any of the Tosfos in, and I don't have any of my Svarim with me, Be'im Sheyiyah, that I'm being chaylik on what the Balei Tosfos held, so batla daiti, and do what the minig of Balei Tosfos is. For example, there's other chuvas like this. The Hagayis Maimoni, the Sefer HaTrumas quotes him. The Tashbitz in a mark of the times. The Tashbitz is referred to, just for lack of confusion, the Tashbitz is referred to as Tashbitz Katan, because the Tashbitz, Reb Shimshon ben Tzemach Doran, a Sfardi, wrote a much longer Sefer Tashbitz, and that became the primary Tashbitz. That's a 6-volume Chuvah Sefer. The Tashbitz Katan, which is the Rami Rotenberg's, Psakim, is a thin sefer like this. When it was printed, it was probably 60 pages. Today, it's slightly expanded because it has a little bit of footwork and legwork done. A little sefer. Tashbitz Katan, in a mark of what the Times was to look like, writes that Kibalti Mimari Maram, which is the Rami Rotenberg who was sitting in prison at the time he was telling this, that Berega Adam Goimer B'daitoi Lias Moiser Nafshel Hashem Shemayim. The minute a person in his mind is Goimer B'daitoi that he's going to be die al Kiddush Hashem, he's not margish any pain anymore. Now that just tells you what we're talking about, the type of people we're talking about, the time we're talking about. This is Berega that he's going with the Moshe Nefesh, he's not going to feel any pain anymore. Now, just as a sad postscript, the Mordechai, who's also a Talmud of the Rami Rotenberg, the famous Mordechai in the back of the Gemara, who's also a Talmud of Rami Rotenberg, and the Sefer HaTrumas, the Hagayis Maimoni. The Hagayis Maimoni and the Mordechai are brother-in-laws. Talmidim of the Rami Rotenberg and brother-in-laws. They both are tragically murdered in a pogrom, which was called the Rheinfleisch pogroms. It's like a whole set of pogroms that happened in the late 1200s in Germany, and it causes the end of all, Jews living there, and they don't come back for like 3 days later. But both of them are murdered al Kiddush Hashem, literally 5 years after the Rami Rotenberg was in prison. To tell you 5 years after his death, meaning the time was a shrekelcha time in Germany. His 2 greatest Talmidim who visited him and wrote his psakim from prison were murdered al Kiddush Hashem. I think if you read, the Mordechai was killed, him and his 5 daughters, his wife and his 5 daughters all together, while he was in the middle of editing his Svarim. The Hagayis Maimoni, I think, was younger than him. He had 1 daughter and a wife. Entire families killed, wiped out, in the middle of writing this Svarim. A terribly tragic time in Jewish history. Now this is the time that the Rosh and the Mordechai and the Rami Rotenberg are living in, that fueled this psak of it's better to stay in prison and not come out. Now, this is like probably a less true part of the story, but an important part of the story anyhow, so I'll share it. But Rami Rotenberg was in prison for 7 years until he died. When he died, they tried to get him to be buried in the Kever Yisrael. Like today, there are some hostages who are dead, who are just waiting for a Kever Yisrael. The king, Rudolf, said that until he gets his original exorbitant sum, there's no coming out. And then Rami Rotenberg's body was buried in prison and stayed there for, depending on the nusach you go with, for 12 years, for 14 years, for a very long time. He was buried in prison. During that time, keep in mind, the entire German Kehillah was destroyed. Most Jews left Germany. There was not much left. Rotenberg was on an island in prison, buried alone. There was a Jew by the name of Rabbi Alexander Ziskin Wimpin. He was from Worms. He's famous not because he was a Gvir, not because of his life. He's famous because of what he did now. And that is, he came to the king, I don't even know if it was Rudolf anymore, and he offered to pay this exorbitant sum, which must have been his entire fortune at the time, and he paid to free the Rami Rotenberg, and on condition that the Kehillah was masking that he'll be buried side by side with the Rami Rotenberg. And legend has it, in this is where it morphs into legend, that's all true. And he is buried in Worms together with Rami Rotenberg. The kever, I think, still exists. It's a dual tombstone that has the Maram and Alexander Ziskin Wimpin on the other side. The legend part is that a day or two later, Alexander Ziskin was nifter. He freed Rami Rotenberg, he buried him, and he died right away after. And the Olam was, you see the Maram's psak still holds. Like the Maram said he shouldn't be freed from prison, you see the psak still holds. You violate the psak, look what happens. And legend has it that Alexander Wimpin came in a dream to a friend of his, and he says, no, that's mamish not what happened. The fakeret. And Rami Rotenberg was very appreciative that I finally was paid him from prison. And here's the story, he says. The night after I was paid to the Rami Rotenberg, I get a dream. And it was clear to me this is the Rami Rotenberg. Maybe it's possible Alexander Wimpin even knew what the Rami Rotenberg looked like. Maybe even remembered him. He says the Rami Rotenberg comes to me in a dream and he says, Yashikayach for being paid to me. I was stuck here. It was time to go to Kever Yisrael. Yashikayach for being paid to me. I'm going to offer you as follows, he says. As a reward, you could either get nachla b'li mitzarim, I'll make you rich beyond your wildest dreams, you, your children, your grandchildren, l'deri deris. You'll be wealthy forever. Or he says, you could come, imi b'mchitzasi. You could come to Gan Eden with me. You freed me, you deserve it, you could come to Gan Eden with me. And he says, of course, so I mulled about it for a second, of course I chose, but I'm going to waste it on money for my eniklach. Yeah, I want to go imi b'mchitzasi. But the Ram says, but there's a catch. Right now you did something that's, I could take you. I could slip you under the gate right now. If you're going to live another 50 years and you're going to do whatever you're going to do, I don't know that I'm going to be able to get you by the guard to bring you in Chizasi. And I said, Avad, I'm in. I signed, I'm in. And Mamela, a day or two later, he died and he's buried in him. This part's the legend part. I don't know if when exactly died, when he didn't exactly die, but it's a beautiful little addendum to the story, whether it's true or not. We're not going to let truth get in the way. This is the story of the Rami Rotenberg, Bishlei Musa, that Yam Shalem is referring to. Now, how long am I talking about? I don't know where I'm up to. What time did we start?
21 minutes.
Okay, I'll go a few more minutes, then I'm gonna pass it off. We'll have to continue. I'm not gonna be able to finish. I'm not gonna be able to finish, but we'll continue. So now, let's try to get to the sugya a little. What's this handlerai? So we said the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, right? It's a din. The Mishnah in Gittin says you're not allowed to be paid the shavif more than its value. Because we're taking oilim. Now the Gemara in Gittin Afanart brings two different timing for this. The Gemara in Gittin either says, because of it's an unfair burden on the kahal. The kahal has limited amount of finance. There's a finite amount of resources that a kahal has, and if you're going to make them pay 20,000 Reichstaler for a thing, they can run out of money. You can't just keep taxing the kahal again. There's a finite amount of resources. You can't keep taxing. That's Siba number one. Siba number two that the Gemara says is the ligrube. We don't want to give motivation for the goyim to keep doing it. If they see that this is a very successful thing that brings them in money, they're going to keep doing it again and again. Now Rashi Afanart says, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is if you're rich, or you have a rich family member. If you have a uncle, a cousin, a rich uncle somewhere, has a lot of money, and he thinks that you're worth it, and he wants to be paid to you, so you're not taxing the tzibur anymore, so knock yourself out. Go be paid for whatever you want. But if you're afraid that it's going to cause bad habits amongst the goyim, and you're going to teach them that they can get away with this, so they don't know the difference that you have a rich uncle, you don't have a rich uncle. Oh, okay, Jews are good to capture. They're going to capture Jews. So this is what Rashi says is the nafkamina of these two taimim, meaning based on if you have family wealth or outside source, could you be samech on that? So that's one nafkamina to keep in mind in regards to this din. Now, another nafkamina to keep in mind is that the Gemara in Gittin tells a story elsewhere. The Gemara in Daf Nun Ches, 15 blot later, tells a story as follows. It says, Ma'aseh Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya shehalach lekrach gadol shebaraymi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya went to the big city, to Rome. This is talking in the Tkufa after the Churban. Amru tinek echad yesh beis asurim. There's a child who's imprisoned over here. Yefei einayim v'toiv roi v'katzoisav sturim le'taltalim. A beautiful child, a gebench the child with a twinkle in his eye. He looks like, this kid looks like something, and he's in prison over there in Rome. So halach v'amad al pesach beis asurim. It says Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya went and he stood by the gate of the prison. Amar, and he said a complicated pasuk, a hard to know pasuk. He said, Amar, mi yeti iten l'meshisa Yaakov Yisrael levuzuzim. Anoi setinik l'amar halei Hashem zechatanu lei v'le'avu b'drachav. The child finished the pasuk, like this obscure pasuk. The child finished it, with fluency. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya says, muftachani boy shemayru Rabbi Yisrael. This is ideal gdula. This is a child with a future. I see this is a child who's going to be a Meir Rabbi Yisrael. Ha'avoida, Lashon Shvua, I'm promising, she'eni zaz mikana she'efdenu b'chamamin she'paisik alav. I will pay whatever it costs to get him out of prison. That's his Amru le'zaz mishama she'patov b'mamin harbe. Chazal say, the Gemara is made, and mezak taka, that this wasn't just hollow words. Rabbi Yeshua Chanani stood, didn't leave until he paid an exorbitant amount of money to free this child from prison. So now, here you seem to see like a Maisa Lister. You have a Mishnah in Gittin without any chaylik that seems to say the Gemara brings two dayas. Okay, we don't have a hachra. We don't know which one is the primary daya, and there's an afkamina between the dayas. So there's makom litfakech. There's room that needs to be figured out over there. But here you seem to have a Maisa Lister. Yeshua ben Chananya is one of the Gedolei Hadar. Someone is muska in the Gemara many times, and B'mam and Harbe. So it sounds like he said, "Eini zaz at she'efdenu b'chol mamin she'whatever." Yeah, was tzevet zayin. Mashmayis to the Gemara is that it was more money. And so 1 second, but this is not my kasha. Taisvis is Ayman on this. Taisvis Afanart and Daf Nun Hey asks this kasha that this seems to be my solicitor. Fact Taisvis. Taisvis doesn't even ask it. Taisvis just says. So Taisvis is one line. Taisvis says ki ikas sakanis nefashis paidin yoser mechdei demeyam. This Mishnah and Gittin that we said that ain't paidin yoser mechdei demeyam, that means when it's just uncomfortable. If there's an actual sakanis nefashis, And even though this Gemara in Gittin doesn't say in particular that there was a Sekanos Nefashis, but Vaisei Beshuva Chananya understood that there was a Sekanos Nefashis, and Ki Yeka Sekanos Nefashis Payid Nesim B'Chdei D'Meim. Now this is what Taisus says, but it's a great Machlekes Rishonim. The Ramban, Afanart, and the Meiri both point this out, that the Gemara in Baba Basra says every Shavi has Sekanos Nefashis. Half of the reason why a Shavi is a mitzvah rabbah, why it's such a big deal, is because it includes Sekanos Nefashis. They tell me now, Ki Yeka Sekanos Nefashis, so every Sekanos Nefashis. So the Meiri says, there's Sekanos Nefashis and there's Sekanos Nefashis. There's near and immediate danger, and then there's, just danger, but it's not immediate danger. This was immediate danger. The Ramban says, no, Taisus is wrong. This is not what the chilik is. The chilik is Talmud Chacham. If you see someone has a future in learning and he's going to be Mamash Talmud Chacham, then you could do it, you could go even against him. The Ramban, I'll read you the words. The Ramban says, Mistaver Talmud Chacham, Paidinais B'chama Min Shaba'ilim, Releka Misham Duchka, Velei Misham Igruye, Shem Avdi Yisrael Mamin, Emesu Misaneim Harbi. And this is a very potent line. He says, if Klal Yisrael loses a lot of money, or they die from their enemies, Yesh Lanu Ki Yitzibem, they're replaceable. I'm reading your Ramban. Klal Yisrael and their money are replaceable. But for Talmud Chacham, Ein Lanu Ki Yitzibem. A real Talmud Chacham, someone who's a real Ein Lanu Ki Yitzibem, that supersedes every Ki Yitzibem. V'kaidim liftas l'melech Ki Yitzibem. This is what the Ramban says. So now you have 2 days in the Rishonim how to interpret the Maisa Lister. Meaning this Gemara that tells us that this rule of Mishnah Gittin is not so hard and fast. It's a suspect to some exceptions. Is a Machlekes Rishonim. Now I'm literally going to stop smack in the middle of the Inyan. There's so much more to get to, but my turn is up. Now Rav Dov is going to continue talking, to be continued. I owe it to you, I'll continue it.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.